Good morning friends and welcome back to NPTEL online certification course on Indian poetry in English. My dear friends, you might well remember at present we are discussing impressionistic poetry Indian poetry in English. And in this regard the former lecture that we did was on Niranjan Mohanty, a meditative voice of Indian English poetry. Today we are also going to talk about one more meditative voice who actually tries to bring his readers aware of the fact that Indian English poetry is rich not only because of the present day happenings, but also because of its rich culture. And this voice is none other than the voice of Charu Sheel Singh. Dear friends, it has actually been a tragedy that there are many such voices which do not get the attention of the critics and the scholars, especially in the field of Indian poetry in English. But my reading of Indian poetry in English, and especially those of some contemporary poets who did not get or who could not get the attention that they deserved, I thought I should take up and analyze the poetic world of some such voices. And in this regard, the voice of late Charu Sheel Singh is of course very major, and we shall discuss Charu Sheel's poetry today. But before we go on to delve deep into the world of Charu Sheel's poetry, let me give you a brief description about who Charu Sheel Singh was and how he became a poet, because it is always said that poets often get their voices in the very prime of their lives. And of course, the socio-political conditions also play a major role. We all remember the fact that after the World War II, the entire world witnessed a sort of decadence and helplessness. Actually, there was a sort of fragmentation, as many of you are aware, of the poetry of T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and others. In Indian English scenario also, we could see this happening. We could find around ourselves an ethically desiccated world of social ills and a religion which had always been a strengthening force, somehow or the other actually got to be relegated. But here is a poet who is so steeped, who is so rooted in Indian customs, Indian traditions, Indian religious practices, that he actually wants a sort of a recovery of faith. So, this poet late Charu Sheel Singh was born in 1955 in Farrukhabad district of Uttar Pradesh, India. He did his PhD from Varanasi on the poetry of William Blake, and later on he also converted it in the form of a book. He also got the opportunity of doing his postdoctorate from the University of Warwick, England in 1982. This poet was a professor and professor of English at Mahatma Gandhi Kashi Vidyapeeth, Varanasi. So, when one reads the poems of Charu Sheel Singh, one finds Varanasi getting personified everywhere, Varanasi getting depicted in all forms, and the religious practices that Varanasi is so proud of and can boast of. We can find the details of those in his poems. It actually reminds me of how once he wrote one poem entitled, a collection entitled Kasi, a Mandala poem. That is actually a narrative, and it talks about Kasi in details. Of course, the poet uses his fertile imagination because the poet right from his early years was influenced by Vivekananda, Ram Tirtha, Adi Shankaracharya, Buddha, and many others. Charu Sheel can be considered to be a traditional poet who belongs to the genre of philosophical poetry. It was actually in his blood that philosophy, religion, comparative literature, all these actually got or infused in him a different sort of inspiration. Charu Sheel is not only a poet, but a critic and a scholar of he is steeped in Indian ethos. Once he said that the poet is the critic and critic is the poet. Now, isn't it quite becoming that we must know who this poet is and how he became a poet, because when he was only at the age of 20, he had started writing poetry. As regards his deep religiosity, because many people still consider Charu Sheel as a poet who is so steeped in learning that his poetry at times appears to be very difficult. Many people have also gone to the extent of calling him very pedantic. But then Professor Singh used to say religion of any kind was always accepted in the family, because he got it as a legacy, with a sense of critique which many times went adverse to prevalent cultural practices. He also says that I was drawn to Buddhist and Hindu tantras in my search for the basics, the rudimentaries that affect and effect normative zone of individual creativity. I wanted to arrive at the seed ideas that grow first as seedlings. So, this is how Charu Sheel himself thinks about Indian tradition, because we believe that Charu Sheel is a poet of Indian tradition. So, majority of his narratives that he has written, one can find the element of religion very dominant. So, he can be considered to be a poet who actually wants to make his readers aware of India's rich cultural and scriptural values. There is a sort of a spiritual quest in his world, because Charu Sheel believes that poetry is a sort of penance. It is actually a form of prayer, and through poetry one can have a sort of peregrination of the soul, the inner journey, the inner journey. One can also come across the binaries of life having gruesome realities. Poetry is not only titillating, poetry is also about educating human beings, and of course, imagination plays a major role in poetry, but at the same time it is through imagination and through reviving the tropes which we have almost left, or which have been left by our ancient heroes, the rich legacy that we have some way or the other relegated or left behind. So, there is actually a sense of awakening the blunted sensibilities of human in the world of, in the poetic world of Charu Sheel. So, Charu Sheel had to his credit so many poetry collections, because as I mentioned earlier, that he was not only a poet, but he was also a critic, and he developed this mandala theory. So, the very first book that Charu Sheel composed was Tapascharnam. It is said that when he was only in his 20s, that he had started writing or composing the songs of Tapascharnam, which was later translated by none other than his father into English. And when he translated it, he called it Tapascharnam Sukdev Ki Pira. That is actually the Hindi translation. But English version of Tapascharnam, which was written in the original, is available. Many of the readers of Charu Sheel will come to know a lot about Indian scriptures, Indian religious traditions, and also the major celebrities of Indian ancient culture through having a reading of Charu Sheel's world. Then came songs of life and death in the year in 1989, then followed by the Indian hero 1993, then creation cocktail. Charu Sheel was not such a poet that who used to write every now and then, but then he really took time, because much of his poetry is full of thoughts, full of ponderings, and that is why he took a lot of time. They are in a way a major source of learning, because one can find the elements of mythological characters, mythological stories, and that can help readers to look beyond what the poet says, and that actually makes Charu Sheel a difficult poet, and that is why majority of the anthologists have failed to include his poetry or his poems. But then that does not belittle the importance of being a Charu Sheel a poet. Scriptures on Stone, Etching on Edge, then Golden Chariots in 2008, then Legacies 2010, then Born Across Millenniums in 2011, and then 10 Mahavidyas in 2016, and finally he did collected poems, where we can find a collection of his major works from 1975 to 2003. I actually am very shocked to tell you that this year only we lost him, the poet that Charu Sheel was. I had a long association with the poet, and that is why I know much about him, but it won't be possible to throw light on majority of his works, but then we shall try our level best to familiarize our readers with major works of Charu Sheel. So, let us have a look at Tapascharanam. The very first book, Tapascharanam, was written when the poet was too young. Can one think of a person so deep in philosophy and religion at such a young stage? And the father, I mean Charu Sheel's father, was often shocked and surprised at the son delving in the realms of philosophy and religion. So, this book Tapascharanam has got 9 chapters and it has got 108 songs. The moment one goes through these songs, one is reminded of Rabindranath Tagore, and one is also reminded of Aurobindo. At times I always used to ask him, how can we find the essence of Aurobindo in your poems? And he used to pass on a very wry smile. So, one can find a mystic journey from the world of time to eternity in Tapascharanam. Tapascharanam actually is a blend of medieval devotional poetry, which is yogic and spiritual traditions of the country. Tapascharanam is full of images, but then when you read it, you will like it because it is written in such a way. It may not have a sort of musicality in terms of rhyme and other things, but then once you start reading Tapascharanam, the songs are so much soaked in thoughts that you won't be able to leave it before you have completed it. There is a delineation of Krishna Dwapen, I mean Vedavyas, as all of you are familiar with Vedavyas, who had written Bhagavad Puran, and it is said that when this book was translated, Tapascharanam was translated, the translator added one more phrase, Tapascharanam Sukdev ki pira. And so, in a way it familiarizes us not only with Sukdev, the sort of struggle Sukdev had, but it is actually the struggle of every human being, it is the struggle of a poet. It is always said about Sukdev that Sukdev was the son of Vedavyas. In fact, Vedavyas did not have any son, and Sukdev had to be in his mother's womb for 12 years, and he did not want to come out because he was so anxious about the chaos of this mundane world. But finally, the struggle that he underwent in the womb of his mother, that actually gave him an opportunity to have a lot of knowledge. We can take some of the poems from Tapascharanam in order to see how deeply the poet is influenced by the ancient scriptures, and how he goes and how he sings. At times we can find that there is a philosophy, but this philosophy is not devoid of meaning. It talks about life in a way, it also talks about the meaninglessness of human life on this mundane earth. While he says, drum beaters accompany the jolly crowd. When I ask them what it is they do, they say it is a marriage of fool, know something of life's bloom. Dropping my head I think how ignorance on them doth wink, they live to marry and marry to die. Is this the life, O earth and sky? So, the poet asks a very philosophical question. They live to marry and marry to die. Is this the life, O earth and sky? So, the poet asks a very existential question, a very philosophical question, that all of us in this mundane world, perhaps we simply are here to marry and marry to die. He smiles at children's hollow souls who play with sand and mud dunes. Now again the poet raises another philosophical question and says, when he says he, we actually can have different interpretations, different referents here. He smiles at children's hollow souls who play with sand and mud dunes. Will there be a time, I ask, when the children shall throw off their mask? My dear friends, when we use this word mask here in this context, this actually is a sort of ostentation, this actually is a sort of cover, and what the poet means to say is that we are living a life which is not of reality, but we are actually following a path where we do not know what is the meaning of life. So, there is a sort of existential crisis which one can find in the work of Charu Sheel Singh. There is a sort of philosophical meandering when he says that will there be a time, I ask, when the children shall throw off their masks. Even all of us being children. So, when we use the word children, we actually mean perhaps all of us are ignorant and do not understand the nitty-gritty of our lives, and that is why we continue to live in a world of ostentations, in a world of pomp and show, to quote Shakespeare, signifying nothing, my dear friend. Fine. And again, poem after poem, you can have such beautiful thoughts. We are frogs in the muddy pond, living our life without a glimpse of the land, eating the filth and making vain claim of our sheer nothingness, oh same. So, the poet time and again in every, when the stanza comes to an end, there is a sort of apostrophe and the poet says, oh, what a sort of life we are living. Perhaps our life is so confined that we cannot go beyond, we cannot think beyond, and we simply are just like frogs in the muddy pond. You can always find references of animal imagery, frogs, snakes, bara, figs and all, because all these they have been taken from our ancient scriptures, and all these have got some sort of incarnation, some sort of disguise. And the poet often asks a question, for a little piece of bread I rove from door to door in the hideous silence of the night for stomach's delight. So, what actually is reality? That only for a crumb of bread we are moving here and there. And the world and the doors of the world are closed for me to remain unfed. I do not find a way out. I mean, those who are actually hungry of, those who are thirsty of, those who actually want to quench their desire. And what sort of desire? So, when I use the word desire, actually means a lot. Indignant dogs bark at the night thief to pluck out the remains of my meat. So, there is a sort of contrary. Even when I get something, even when I steal something out of out of hunger, even the dogs find to pluck out the remains of my meat. Whatever I get, perhaps I am being deprived of that. So, what a sort of cruel world we are living in. Oh, same. Fine. So, the time and again the poet asks such a questions, and the questions are not devoid of philosophical interpretations and underpinnings. Then came songs of life and death. Again, you can find in majority of the poems of Charu Sheel, the same question is being repeated, and the question of life, the question of death, the question of what is permanent, the question of what is immortal, the question of what is ethereal. And we human beings are always crazy after all these temporary pleasures, all these earthly pleasures, without knowing that someday or the other this has to come to an end. So, these songs of life and death are also the outpourings of an anguished soul. Protagonist is seen as a paribrajak or a tathagata, and the entire work is full of imagery, ranging from, there is a vast range of imagery from history, from mythology, from philosophy, and also from literature. And then the lines that we come across, they remind us of a sort of fragmentation, they remind us of a sort of life that we are living. And here, when he uses history is a monument of clipped wings, we are reminded of T.S. Eliot. The Eliatian echo one can find. Many scholars have gone to the extent of calling Charu Sheel as an Indian Eliot. So, history is a monument of clipped wings. Let us go back to T.S. Eliot's poem Geronson, where he says, history is a cunning passage of contrived corridors. Fine. So, here Charu Sheel says, history is a monument of clipped wings and fissured sense, for how shall Albion rise again? We are imaginative pastures of land growing upon the iron milk of the tender bosoms of our mothers. Why mothers should be hoarse every time is not known. And the poet again puts a question, why mothers should be hoarse? So, again to this beautiful civilized world, he raises a question, why should our women be converted into horse, and who is responsible for all this? Is there someone to tell us and make our lives less forlorn? Can we get these answers to know and to have more of our queries being answered? Why are we left isolated? So, as I have been saying that if you once start reading Tapas Charnam and songs of life and death, you can find that they are so much clad in thought, so much wrapped in philosophy, that for a common reader it is very difficult to unfold the meanings or unwrap the meanings. Let us take poem number 29 from this, where he says, it is million of years since that flowers have bloomed without the perfume of human desire. It is with fingernails that I dig the ground of my grave to claim it mine. We are perhaps trying to dig our past. Let all wait for another millennium, when I might break my destiny's ground and uncover the evils of my earthly swine. Can we? Do we ever get the time to think of what we are doing? Do we ever get the time to retreat and claim our rich legacies? Perhaps not. And that is why he says, it is million of years since that flowers have bloomed. All our beautiful messages and lessons have already been buried in this beautiful earth, in this all our scriptures. But have we got the time to dig? Have we got the time to think? Have we got the time to ponder over, my dear friend? And then came Indian Hero. The title of this collection is Indian Hero, and here he talks about so many Indian heroes which have actually made us proud, but then we are perhaps straying from their paths and we have taken a different path. Here in this collection, the poet actually refers to Brahma, Krishna, Buddha, Christ and all, and then talks about how they could become great, and then in a way he tries not only to familiarize us, but also to civilize us, because the younger generation, they are actually reveling and rejoicing in a different sort, and the poet actually wants to recover their faiths. Of course, the Indian Hero is a beautiful piece of intuition and intellect. The poem, if you have a look at its structure and at its syntactic structure and linguistic meaning, you can find that the poem is a postmodern one. The poet is not untouched, not unaffected by the new current of the postmodern realities, and then he mixes the sublime with the absurd and the myth of creation. Let us take some lines from that, where how the poet also raises questions on history, raises questions of our ancient scriptures, and then there are references to Mahabharata, and then the poet actually talks about how women were treated and how women have been treated even in the past, and what were our civilized people doing. Are we still not repentant? Should we not repent over what happened to Draupadi? And then he says, Arjunas are not born in assemblies that tear naked Draupadi's clothes. They take birth in the jungles where Dronacharyas live and take and mold destinies. So, there is a question on this patriarchal order, where why all these people were silent when Draupadi was being maltreated. And that is why the poet says, Arjunas are not born in assemblies that tear naked Draupadi's clothes. They take birth in the jungles where Dronacharyas live and take and mold destiny. So why have we strayed from our path? Again, we can take some more lines. In the fertility myths of kaleidoscopic metaphor, the limbs of the hero are scattered all over Himalaya and Gangetic plains. The hero has no mother, no father. Somebody who is hero, somebody who is victorious, somebody who is a savior, he should actually come above all these petty considerations. Fine? The hero has no mother, no father. He is self-constituted progeny of its sacred lineaments. He is himself. In himself he grows. In himself he is born, and he succumbs to temporal energies. By saying all this, the poet actually tries even to strengthen the common people, that they should not simply sing the glories, rather they should also try to imbibe, because all these people who have been heroes, all these people who we revere, they are actually self-made. Of course, there can be a requirement of a guru, but at the same time, unless and until the hero has got a self-desire, a self-inspiration, the hero cannot become a hero, my dear friend. So, in a way we find the general characteristics of Charu Sheel's poems are that he from time to time regenerates Puranic and Upanishadic tradition. One can find a blend of psychic and mystic combination. The narrative mode is always spontaneously flowing, where he says history is a whole. Find the poet actually puts before us a question as to should we not interrogate our history? Why should we simply be proud of it? We have strayed from our path, and the need of the hour is still to recover our lost paths, to recover our cultural legacies that actually have been pushed towards the margin. There is an element of existential truth, and one can also find a sort of phenomenological knowledge preserved in Charu Sheel's poems. Then came Creation Cocktail. If you have a look at the titles of Charu Sheel's poems, you will find that in every poem, because he was actually a scholar of Blakean tradition, so there is a lot of symbolism. Creation Cocktail, in this beautiful collection, he talks about creation, he talks about birth, and there when he takes us to the world of his own poetic realm, we find how he mentions that how this earth, when the earth wanted to create something, the earth had got several questions before. So, this volume is also full of Indian mythological narrative of creation. The poet actually posits or opinionates the universe as an outcome of pralaya, and as an outcome of pralaya, where the earth actually wanted to create, and while creating there is actually a delineation or a portrayal of the cosmic process of creation and birth. So, one can find a panorama of the earth as a vacuity. The earth was actually a vacuity which was oscillating between the layers below and the spheres above. Of course, when a poet talks about all these things, the earth having different layers, and the poet delving deep in these layers and then trying to find about our scriptural truths, naturally his poetry would appear to be very difficult for poetry lovers who simply want to have a sort of ready-made enjoyment and entertainment, and that is why Charu Sheel's poetry is a bit difficult. But then it actually makes us aware, it actually entertains us, and it educates us at the same time, because the way he puts some of the messages wrapped in it. Say for example, when he says, God is not a territory or a mountain top. Now there, once again, first let me read it and then we will come to it. God is not a territory or a mountain top or even a plateau of conscience which one can go to occasionally for self pleasure. So, now at times we have been talking of how we Indians often go to offer our prayers in temples, but the poet here raises a question that if you go there occasionally simply to find God, God is not there. He writes Bibles of love and breathes death and life into myriads of syllables which are gyrated, time sustaining, a world that God continually creates and destroys. So, what is the essence? The essence is that going to the temple and paying or praying or offering which you make once, that does not mean that you are having a sort of divine faith or whatsoever. God is every now and then all around us, because God writes Bibles of love, and then there is a reference to it, the way we are fighting against each other. Fine, there are stripes, but then does God actually want that? We have already read in the previous lecture how Niranjan Mohanty says that I am bound with karma and dharma. So, my dear friends, Indian ethos says that God is every now and then around us. God is omniscient, God is omnipotent, God is omnipresent, my dear friend. Then came etching on the edge, etching on the edge. Once again you look at the title, etching on the edge. Now, here again the poet says lots of things, and again you can come across the reference of Sita, Draupadi, fine, and many more. When he says, it was Sita who bore the brunt of banishment, scripting songs gods understood not, and stories time cannot tell. Devotion annuls difference, like a cauldron messing and burning the dross for the purity of gold. Fine. So, Sita had to give the Agni Pariksha, all of you know that, and then the poet once again asks the question, why should Sita give an Agni Pariksha? Why there is a different sort of treatment? And the poet says, good and evil songs distribute mornings and evenings into bricolage that never intercede. The middle is a woman ever trying to be a man. Krishna is a concentricity. Krishna is a concentricity and a communion within and without. Draupadis are metrical Jones that cry often for help and shout. So, even in our scriptures, the way women have been treated, the poet is not happy with it, and the poet actually intrigates, and that is why he says there is a sort of recovery needed. Now, those people who said that Charu Sheel was a poet who was steeped only in religiousness and in mythologies and all, perhaps obliterate the fact that Charu Sheel also wrote some poems about love, but then of course, this love is of a different sort. Either it is a divine love, or when he talks about love, then he also raises a question. For example, when he talks about Savitri and when he talks about Draupadi, the way he says, let us take some lines from Etching on Edge, and he says, there is serenity in time shrouded all over into the perfidy of details. Satyabans are stolen monuments and Savitris sparrows of beaming gold. We have already read much about Savitri and Satyavan while we were discussing Aurobindo, fine. But then here also Charu Sheel refers to Satyavans are stolen monuments. I would rather substitute the word stolen and say winning monuments. It is because of the tapasya, it is because of the penance of Savitri that Satyavan was brought back. And again, when the poet talks about Draupadi, he says, one does not win or lose woman in a culture. We are so proud of our culture, but should we not remember how we lost Draupadi only in a game? One does not win or lose woman in a culture of symbolic forms. Pandavas lost glories to the top, giving way to satiric zone of ironic mention. And then the poet once again puts a question, that is women a commodity, the question that is being raised every now and then. So, the poet says that even in our ancient scriptures, this has not been taken seriously. And again, while he talks about the immortal love of Mumtaz, and in whose memory the Taj Mahal was created, the poet says, and there the poet derides the love of Shah Jahan and says it was not only Shah Jahan's love, but think about the love of all those people who had actually created, who had actually made that beautiful structure called Taj Mahal. And the poet says, he had murdered millions of Mumtaz that could have grown into trillions of Taj. And he has a sympathy with those laborers who were amputated, as you all know. Love is not a tattooed locale nor a shivering calf of empty universalism. It is circulating blood beyond cockney ideas that create a phone which morphemes mortality into a live syntax. Love is an engrossing juncture. Love is an engrossing juncture of being. Love is an engrossing juncture of being that eternally assimilates the ever segregated into its tertiary fold of sanguine imagination. But then Shah Jahan became great, Mumtaz became immortal because a structure was created. But what about the love of all those people who had actually been left devoid of the company of their own beloveds? Did anyone think about the love of all those laborers? Perhaps not. Fine. Then came scriptures on stones, where the poet very mockingly says, our scriptures have become stones, and we too who do not understand them. So, there is actually we think our duty is over once we have inscribed something on the stones, and we think that we are actually reminiscing our scriptures and we are paying our humble prayers. But then the poet says, scriptures have become stones, and we too, our consciences have also become stones who do not understand them. So, if it is written on them, one needs to go beyond and think about, but perhaps not. We simply go for a pleasure trip, on a pleasure trip, derive pleasure, come back, forget. So, in this collection we find a collection of 10 poems comprising Ram, Rabidas, Sabri, Eklavya, Taj Mahal, Gandhi, Mira, Buddha, Kabir and Ganga. So, you can find all sorts of these representative heroes which history has got included in several books and scriptures, but then it is one way to remember them and to familiarize our new generations with these realities and know them. So, in one poem after another, whether it is the delineation of Rama, whether it is the delineation of Rabidas, or is it the delineation of Sabri. So, through all these, love is at the center of it. And when the poet talks about in the famous poem Rama, he says, the God incarnate now decided to decamp Sita's linear figures into a vertical zone of conscience that cried hoarse into normativities not Rama's own. Morality fixtures are not clandestine horse races that one wins or loses in the notoriety of time. The socially cultured fabrics of Rama's being made him love what he should have hated. Fine, but then could Ram really, because what happened, Sita was always by his side, but could he really protect Sita when Sita was being kidnapped? No. And then the poet again says, the exterior Ram had lost the interior Ram, and the fabric facade of degenerated symbols could not bring Sita back. Sita refused to get back to where Ram was, for her linear glory was sold on the pseudo pyres of sanctity. So, again the poet puts a question in the mouth of Sita, and it is a question not only to Rama, it is a question to the patriarchal order, my dear friends. Again he takes up another poem entitled Rabidas, where he talks about Rabidas, the famous saint, who came from a low caste, leather working caste, but then he had acclaimed a lot of respect even among various religions, across religions. And then the poet says, Rabidas became a cobbler by virtue or vice that he perforated in his yesteryears. Even Brahmin's refusal to dine with Raidas made him dine with each one of them in a distinct game of seasons where one center multiplies into peripheral zones that acquire a centrality of own. The poet here actually says that caste is not that important. It is through your personal endeavors and your personal penance that you can have a sort of achievement. And you know, Rabidas had become famous, and many of Rabidas' lines, because Rabidas has got a very reverent space even in among Sikhs and all, and you can find greater details about Rabidas. A 15th or 16th century Bhakti saint Rabidas was, and you know, Rabidas happened to be the guru of Meera. Meera accepted Rabidas as her own guru. Meera's search for guru was a tale, interchanged costumes in euphorias of soulful have and sensuous budgetary of seasons. Broken and torn, solitary and forlorn, Meera met destiny in the breaking of her footwear. Meera actually had her footwear broken, and then which she requested Raidas to sew and save her from a smear. Raidas saw beyond horizontal binaries into elemental destiny. So, it continues, you can have a look at it because you know I always believe that at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. Then there is a depiction of Sabari where the poet describes the Sabari, even she was born of a forestrian flowing river into the mountains high and ditches nigh, but Sabari actually wanted to offer Rama the plum that was sweet, and for that she had to test it. Maybe it can be considered different, but Rama accepted it. And Sabari was a Dalit, a downcast lady with an inverted uphill. Rama was a Kshatriya god seeking Sita. Sabari became a scripture on the stony walls of her being that divinely moved in a million of years in the agony of love and the berries of tears. Sabari was a tribal and a Sudra too, who outsmarted history's piercing shafts, changing herself into a galaxy of stardom nest. It continues, my dear friend, and then he also talks about Eklavya, who had not hesitated when Dronacharya wanted some sort of Guru Dakshina. It is actually said that Dronacharya had refused to become Eklavya's Guru, and Eklavya returned and made a clay of Dronacharya and worshipped him, and he achieved perfection at archery. And then when Dronacharya came to know about it through Arjun, Dronacharya asked for a Guru Dakshina, and what Eklavya did? Eklavya actually cut his thumb and offered it. So, this is how the poet actually tries to say that it is not the question of caste, it is actually a question of reference, it is actually a question of faith, it is question of determination, it is actually a question of how one can win through one's own determination. Drona got the thumb and Eklavya bled in more senses than one. The difference between Shahjahan's butchery of mason hands and Eklavya's cutting of thumb resides only in this, that the one ordered butchery while the other begged for it. And the poet actually shows very beautifully the difference, my dear friend. You can have a look at the lines I have already provided. Fine. Now, the question that I once asked, because Charu Sheel's poetry is very pedantic, philosophical and all, and when I once in an interview I asked him about poetry, what he says is really a very awe-inspiring. He says that poetry can be a source of sensuous enjoyment, is a message given by the dilettantes of culture. He does not believe that poetry is a sensuous enjoyment, but he says poetry has always been penance, suffering, pain that ultimately leads to enlightenment. The words in poetry are not used in ordinary sense of the term. They are earned by the poet, germinated by him in the soil. The poetic land is furrowed by the poet's own labor and sweat, the motivational component not excluded. Regarding the metaphysical elements, as the poet himself says, my poetry needs an initiated reader. Indianness is largely our spiritual heritage, which I make use of as a dimension of human consciousness. However, The verbal repertory in which I couch the spiritual experience is a postmodern medium in which the image and symbol seems to be generating illusions of various kind. It is ultimately such images that lead to the Tathagata which all of us should become. So, we as poetry lovers, poetry readers and poets should be a sort of Tathagata, a sort of Paribrajaka. We always should be in search of meaning, and that the words of a poem are not only for sensuous enjoyment, but they are for a sort of enlightenment. Of course, there has been few works on Charu Sheel, but then there have been poets and critics who have of course appreciated the oeuvre, the poetic oeuvre of Charu Sheel, and what is of quite significant to note is about O.P. Mathuru says that poetry of Charu Sheel is decidedly a meta experience. That is why it is it is difficult. And then what Nisat Jaidi says is the fragmentary and disconnected stanzas, kaleidoscopic uses of myths gathered from around the globe, all these elements deconstruct the possibility of master narrative of epic mode. My dear friends, to unravel the beauty of Charu Sheel as a poet requires too much of time, but then we are sorry because we have a limitation of time. So, we can make a sort of estimate about the poet that Charu Sheel as a poet connects the Oriental and the Occidental. He follows the native model and provides us with a spiritual quest. His poems enable readers to relive Indian characters and to inaugurate a new beginning. His poetry is a process of self discovery, and I hope that the coming generation poetry lovers will find a lot of thought in the world of Charu Sheel's poetry. And let me end here with some of the lines once again from Tapascharanam, where the poet says, "The sun shall shine when I shall leave the cell, meadows shall not for long whine, due to leaves temporary fall, because life is to come and to go. Corpses are another name for births, and births for deaths. Life and death are continuities. Wisdom self stretches out itself from the life's lulling wealth." My dear friends, with this note, with this optimistic note, we have to wind up this talk, but I do hope that the posterity will remember Charu Sheel as a poet who always decided and understood that life is a journey, and a good poet has an aim not only to entertain, but to educate, but to enlighten. With these words, I end this lecture. Thank you very much. I wish you all a very good day.